Hello, I am Suzanne Hilser-Wells, President of GG&A, and I am delighted to welcome you to the latest edition of our Thought Leadership Series. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom or top of your screen. We won't have time to answer them during the session, but we will post answers on our website in the days ahead. I am joined today by J.T. Forbes, President of the Indiana University Foundation. Before assuming this position 18 months ago, J.T. served as the CEO of the Indiana University Alumni Association for almost 12 years. A two-time alumnus of the university, he began his career there at the Lilly School of Philanthropy before joining the Office of Public Affairs and Government Relations. JT is a well-regarded leader in the field of advancement, and among the volunteer leadership roles he has held are trustee of CASE and chair of its Summer Institute in Alumni Relations. Thank you for being here today, JT.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for reading the introduction my mother wrote for you. I really appreciate that.
Right, exactly. You're welcome, Mrs. Forbes. So before assuming your current role, you had a very successful tenure at IU's Alumni Association. How did you partner with the fundraising team at the foundation when you were in that position?
Sure. Yeah, I got to say, just at the top of this, lately I've been feeling a little bit like a unicorn because I haven't really met somebody in my current role that has experience across all the domains of institutional advancement, alumni relations, development, marketing, communications, and government relations over the last 30 years. So I kind of think I've been asking for money in all the languages of advancement. So I assumed the chief alumni officer role in 2010. And the day after I was hired, I was told by the president that my reporting line was shifting to the IU Foundation. And by fall, I was invited to join the senior management team. And what I'd say is that in the early days, it was really more of a collaboration than a partnership. And that is where we're just very open, at least at the senior management level, of just joining forces to try new things. And I really credit Gene Temple and Marty Heil, who were the president and EVP for development, for being so open to that. And it just allowed us to kind of say, okay, we've got a lot of good things we've done over time, but what could we try that's new and different? And so it just started with that spirit of partnership and collegiality.
That's wonderful. So as you were just mentioning, when you began in alumni relations, Indiana's alumni program was really very separate from the foundation, and that evolved over time. What motivated that change from the institution's perspective, and how did you go about affecting that change? Because that's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, well, I kind of came to the role by leaning in and just leading with curiosity. So we started doing a lot of research, and I did a lot of listening. And it didn't take long for all of us to realize that the IU Alumni Association and IU Foundation were really working with overlapping constituencies, and that the majority of our audiences really didn't differentiate the Alumni Association or the foundation from IU. It's all under the IU trident. And so we just built on that by bringing staff into shared teams that focused on supporting both engagement and fundraising. Specifically, that meant our annual giving, marketing, and membership staff started to try to operate as one team. We did these constituent panels and a program of research to better understand our alumni and also test ideas and approaches with them. Data and IT became something where we already had a common database, but our teams were working separately. We did a series of planning around a regular program of events where messaging for alumni and foundation priorities were mentioned to put IU's best foot forward. We started a day of engagement and giving called IU Day. And we also shared space in offices we opened in Chicago and Washington, D.C. At the outset. We just said, well, let's try this and see how it goes. By 2015, we did a formal examination of the relationship between the two organizations. I felt like, for every 80 years, it's probably a good idea to kind of
kick the tires.
Yeah, kick the tires, take stock of it. I learned a lot about change management in that experience because really there was no support for merging the two organizations from the majority of members on the two boards that govern these two separate nonprofits. So we just continued on the path of intentional collaboration. New president of the foundation, new leadership team in the development office, and the For All Bicentennial campaign was well underway. And as that gained momentum, the marketing collaboration really stalled out to meet campaign needs. But we continue to conduct constituent research to keep the Alumni Association running in the race for relevance. And we sunsetted some ineffective programs to start new ones because we started applying net promoter research to see what we could do better or differently to have people be likely to get others involved. And we secured funding for expanded alumni engagement events around in major markets in the US and abroad. And we began the process of reinventing our membership program. Now doing that really in a strategic evidence-based mindset, kind of like GGA uses, taught us, not kinda, like you really do, really well, taught us some hard truths. Students do not connect to their institutions because of what the advancement staff does. You heard me, students do not connect to the institutions because of what advancement does. The dominant themes, if you dig into it, in the Gallup and National Survey of Student Engagement work that's being done, that I've reviewed, and I've also looked at numerous other papers and publications, and they all validate that students connect when they have a meaningful experience that spans beyond a semester and feel that someone really cared about them at the institution that they attended. Now, I do think the messaging we do around giving, the work we do to involve students in meaningful experiences that we facilitate is an important part of answering that. But I think sometimes we had to learn the hard truth that it's not about us, that it's about them. And using this peer-reviewed work that's drawn off the voice of students gives you a different way to have to think about that. So a lot of times we're still trying to learn how to connect the dots rather than create them. Dues programs. For us, this may not be true everywhere, but dues programs really didn't work anymore. Tons of work on this. Recent generations of alumni are not willing to pay for their alumni status. We found that solicitations were undermining our overall fundraising strategy because it focused on paying to get something rather than giving to support a compelling cause within the university. And the program also operated at a net loss when you looked at the staffing and cost of solicitation. Mm. So we shifted to a new model. This is just a few years before I made this transition here, that gives alumni the ability to declare their connection to IU at no cost, and then make gifts to support the cause of alumni engagement, which is really a call to help one another. Not, hey, let's have better parties, but no, hey, this organization is a facilitator of connections that engender loyalty and community among our alumni. And I'm really excited to see where my successor, Tricia Rivera-Stumpf, takes that. Also, presidents, I asked them all. I asked all of them multiple times. Presidents, chancellors, and our deans. What I learned from that is they're only going to invest in fundraising and not engagement. When state and tuition revenues are constrained, they make tough choices. Investment and engagement isn't tied to growth in the size of alumni body. We made that case. But investments in fundraising are quantified more quickly. And engagement not linked to fundraising outcomes is super squishy and subjective and hard to explain to busy presidents, chancellors, and deans. So we had to accept that truth and make moves to reposition ourselves. A couple other things. We learned that what alumni say they want and what they actually do don't always link up. In fact, a lot of our, right? So a lot of our survey work found that a lot of the things they thought the Alumni Association should do, they thought were important. When you ask a follow-up to say, would you do it? Or would you participate or take advantage of it? It was really kind of seen as insurance. Like they thought it was important to be there, but they weren't necessarily going to do it for themselves. They thought it needed to be there for others. A great example of that is careers.
Yeah, careers, yep.
Like a lot of what people wanted with job placement, and universities don't do that beyond graduation. And they'd be competing in a market of places that do that. But they do look for career relevant content. But the way we traditionally approach that had to kind of evolve over time. And then this is probably unique to a place like Indiana that's huge and complex and multi-campuses, but I've always struggled with this. Big schools have a bigger is better mentality that's hard to reverse. Because if you look under the hood of alumni engagement and fundraising, what you find is smaller and smarter works better. It's 80-20 rule. If you look at all this stuff, if you're lucky, 20% of the people are engaged in leading and giving and advocating and recruiting and doing all the things we want alumni to do. But we are constantly wanting more. And in the end, sometimes we're not stewarding and managing our volunteers and donors as effectively as if we just accept that we've got a community among a base that we can build, and we can leverage their connections and influence to grow the support for the institution. Introduce us to your friends and make them IU's friends, for example. But sometimes we're kind of shaking hands and looking over the shoulder of that person, looking to speed date the next person, instead of really focusing and understanding their motivations, their interests, their passions, and being really satisfied that a strong core will lead us where we want to go. Those are some of the kind of things we had to learn the hard way.
That's
And by
really,
we, I mean
really
me.
interesting. Yeah. Well, and it's really interesting because you can think of there's a corollary right on the annual giving side. If you are focused on our participation rates, at some point you are probably doing that not probably, at some point in that spectrum, you are doing that at the expense of dollars because you're
Yeah,
not focusing on the people who are most inclined to be really supportive of you.
yeah. The whole rankings thing that gets in the mix
Yeah.
creates a lot of fog and all this really is corrosive to the effort to really do some of this, because you're chasing all those things and they sometimes get in the way of what we're trying to do in development, in my opinion.
Yeah, and not to spill the beans on some of our own conversations, but you and I did have to show the math problem to some people at Indiana to explain, and it doesn't even really move the needle that much on the thing that you're talking about. So, or barely. So, JT, really interesting. I think, what you described, even though, as you say, it's different at every institution, this idea of collaboration and coordination, evidence-based decision-making, and not being afraid to look at some of those sacred cows, those are applicable no matter what your culture and your history and your program structure looks like. So those are really important but hard, right? It's easy for me to summarize in 2 sentences, but those aren't easy things for institutions to do.
No, they're not. They're not. And the longer we think that change is happening to other institutions and not us, the more we imperil our future.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a good lead into my next question. So now here you are, the president of the IU Foundation. How do you feel that your work in alumni relations, particularly at the IU Alumni Association, prepared you for that? And are there things that are surprising to you or different than you thought they'd be?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, first, I always have to tell everybody, because I am of IU and I've spent most of my career here with some stops other places. They're always like, wow, this must be your dream job. And I got to say that this is never a job I dreamed of having until people started talking to me about doing it. And the first thing I have to say about the experience at the Alumni Association, it was really transformative. A lot of that has to do with the people I worked with who believed in me and also challenged me, because I'd come to that role fresh out of the private sector, working with C-suite people, and I'd learned a certain way of approaching things that was pretty direct, and I had a lot of impatience about improving things, and it took a group of them to come to me and say, what you got you here isn't going to get you to the next level. And they told me to get a coach, and they told me to change my approach. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The other part of it, though, is that when you have your own command, it's a huge growth experience, because the way the Alumni Association is set up as IU, it's kind of a hybrid where it's both a university department and its own nonprofit. And so you have to generate revenue, you got to lead people and staff and volunteers, and you got to make a payroll. So that has a high level of accountability, integrity, and transparency, because you're doing it in front of everybody with the full light and truth of whether you're doing it well. And so it was a really good preparation for running this independent nonprofit foundation that was created to support fundraising operations and manage the endowment and all the compliance and promise keeping that goes with that. So it was just an incredible experience. I'll tell you, I think I told you this, Suzanne, a few months ago. At first, coming over here, I came as an interim between a presidential transition and a pandemic. I don't recommend that for anybody with a faint heart. But at first, it really kind of felt like going from being the governor of a small, feisty state to the president of the United States. And it's really because of the complexity issues that come to this role, the need to manage my energy as well as my time, tracking all the interactions, because we have a pretty robust system to make sure we all know who's talking to who and what we're learning in those conversations. And for me, that was really important to do a lot of it and document a lot of it to model the kind of behavior we all need here to be successful. And then also really thinking strategically about developing relationships that connect people with ideas. All that I did at the Alumni Association, but back to this thing about a state versus a nation. The way the institution is set up, the scope of the Alumni Association doesn't really grow with the size of its alumni body. And the business model is one where you really have to go use what you have multiple ways. And in this role, the resources are more available for strategic investment because it's built on the growth of the endowment with the way our business model is set up here. But also you're just dealing with a lot more complexity across multiple campuses on something that's really critical to the bottom line economic and programmatic health of the institution in ways that the Alumni Association contributes. Because if we don't engender loyalty among our alumni, there is no way to start a conversation about where we go next, or it's a lot harder at least. And so that was a big difference. But what I'll just tell you is the same, is that you work with people who have a deep faith in what universities can do. And some of the people that I work with now have a broader scope of influence and resources in order to really leverage that to make things happen. But they all care deeply about the well-being of others. They all have almost an irrational faith in Indiana University. And all are prone to heroic measures, grand gestures, and really doing whatever they possibly can for the betterment of the institution and its role in advancing knowledge and transforming lives. And so that part is common. And that's been one of the easiest parts of this, because I think sometimes people start to develop stereotypes of who's where. I do this I have a neighbor that hosts a evening pizza thing, and he's done it all through the pandemic. And as I've switched this role, it's really been interesting to talk to him because he has certain biases about how people of means behave and act and are motivated. And it's been kind of a fun thing to check in on that, because people are not that different. They really aren't. And sometimes in alumni work and development work, we start to think they are. But at the core, people are the same.
Yeah, well, and that I think on both sides really motivated by a deep belief in Indiana University, as you said, whether it's because they benefited from it themselves or a family member, or because there's a problem that IU is tackling that they believe IU can make a real difference with. And so I think you're right, that kind of baseline, why stay attached, why stay involved, or why become involved if you're not an alum, is a huge motivator.
Again, over the course of my time at the university, I've had interactions with donors and all the different constituencies because of this multifaceted career I've had. And what I would say is, when in the deep conversations you have with donors, their motivation is not their own self-aggrandizement or glory. They're really at the root of it is belief in something we can do that's important to them. You know, one of our biggest gifts this year came from a couple who were motivated by a desire to try to do something that was going to help us better understand and maybe even cure bipolar disorder. yes, there's a lot of money at stake they've invested. Yes, their names on stuff. Yes, it's a big deal. But when you talk to them, they're concerned about never having another family have to go through what they did. And I got a million stories like that. And I think sometimes if we would focus more on that narrative and more on the impact and more on what we're trying to do, it would do all institutions a lot better. Because when you put out the big number, you might get the headline, but it misses the story of the meaning, purpose, and hope that comes from these kinds of gifts. And whether they be modest or whether they be major, by whatever language we want to use. That's again where I think that alumni work really prepared me for that, because there's a pastoral role that you play as an alumni director at a place like this that really requires you to be a good steward of people's faith in the institution. And I think I do believe that makes me uniquely prepared for this job at this time. And I'm really grateful they got to do that.
Yeah, well, and I would say they're very lucky you're doing it. So we see a lot of institutions where fundraising and alumni engagement are not aligned, or not as aligned as they could be. So what advice would you give to those teams who've got, the desire to work more collaboratively perhaps, but just really haven't had the history or the infrastructure to support that?
Sure. There's a lot of being. There's a lot of human being and not doing. So first, be curious. It really helps if you take the time to understand what your colleagues are trying to accomplish, and asking questions to understand and to identify areas of common need. Because too often, I think everybody gets in a hurry. We develop these mental models of what alumni professionals do and what development professionals do, and we don't go a layer deeper and ask questions to really seek to understand and find ways we can work better together. So be curious. Another part of being is being clear. Be aware of your biases, both conscious and unconscious, which might be obstructing better alignment, because there's just a lot of meta things that I've just listened to through my whole love affair with my alma mater, where sometimes alumni staff have been enculturated to subtly undermine what goes on in development, and for development in professionals to also not fully appreciate the very heavy lift of what alumni professionals do with a lot less resources, and to build that kind of community of faith. So I think being clear. The other part about this is a lot of times we go into these conversations without being really clear about what we're trying to accomplish individually, and then work to find those shared outcomes where we could work better together. Again, we get in a hurry, because especially when we're in campaign mode, we are under such pressure to produce more contacts and more dollars, more donors, that we lose sight of how we can do that better, more collaboratively, if we take a step back and think through things a little bit more. We also need to be authentic about concerns and fears in these conversations. Sometimes we jump over that instead of being open about that. Development officers develop these very intimate relationships with people, and they're nervous about bringing somebody else into it that could disrupt the flow and momentum of that relationship. And alumni people I'm generalizing, I know, but we're so eager to please and help and share that sometimes we need to hear what our colleagues are trying to accomplish and do the next right little thing rather than the big thing. Let's see. And this is probably one of the roughest ones for all of us. Collaboration is about joint gains and not getting other people to do what you need them to do for you. Collaboration is an art. And sometimes we think collaboration is, oh, you need to go do this for me so that I get this thing done, instead of really understanding it's about joint gains. My last B in being a human being in all this is to be courageous. Change is not for the faint-hearted or for fence sitters. It's important that everybody finds allies who will be constructive critics and fierce collaborators that are willing to experiment and then scale up. Sometimes the person that's the most honest and direct with you and tells you something you don't want to hear or gives you facts that blow up your big idea are your best friends. And sometimes in these conversations, we misunderstand that. Also, often we don't take the time to build coalitions of the willing. We just kind of take prisoners or hostages along the way. And so I think really working with people that want to work with you, that know it's okay to fail forward, which means try something that's well conceived and don't abandon it if it doesn't turn out exactly like you want, but learn from that and improve and scale as you go. And then another one is resist the urge to engage with those crazy makers who are so good, so adept at creating overly complex, difficult scenarios where nobody wins. You just got to do it. And the corollary to that is to choose wisely. Conflict and tension is inherent in change. Trade-offs are a part of every decision we make. Accept it. And in those moments of angst that come with setbacks and surprises, good, bad, and in between, choose whether you want to be Elsa from Frozen or Taylor Swift. Elsa reminds us to let it go, and Taylor Swift calls us to shake it off. And both are telling us to keep moving forward. So there's just days where I'm like, oh. And you just have to manifest that. And of course, music is a balm for those really rough moments too. And ain't nobody better at that than Aretha. Aretha can get you through anything.
So that's your important advice. So I will share that on days when I know I'm going into some challenging meetings, I have a Beyonce mix that I listen to.
I have a colleague whose hype song is Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to have to explore that offline because that's amazing.
It is.
But I would just say, I think one of the things that I've admired that you have done really well in this change management, and really thinking about a lot of the pieces of advice that you just shared and how to bring those together, is spending the time to help people understand their shared challenge. What is the problem that they all can identify and get behind? Because then the solutions are, you have to work on them. Maybe one solution isn't immediately the right one, but finding a shared solution is a requirement because you've all defined this challenge together. And I think you've just done such a wonderful job at that in your current role. And I know that really helped affect change. So I would kind of add that to your list of, how to get started in some of the things that you talked about.
Well, for me, it all goes back to the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, because I owe such a debt to the founders and funders and faculty of that venerable enterprise. Because at the time I was part of it at the beginning, it was still called the Center on Philanthropy at that time. The whole thing was oriented and grounded in philanthropy as voluntary action for the public good, and philanthropy grounded in the liberal arts and its historical context, which ultimately goes back to the idea of love of humanity and love of humankind. And so to me, ultimately, we've got to approach that with that attitude of love, where we're really trying to live the best version of what philanthropy is about, which is not our own glory or pride. It's improvement of the human condition because we believe in the power of humanity to do things in a better and different way. And so I appreciate what you're saying, but I really owe it to those people that kind of took me from a rough lump of clay with a lot of and helped shape me as a leader.
That's great. Thank you. Well, JT, thank you so much for being here today. This was really wonderful. I always enjoy our conversations. This was some, I think, really terrific practical advice for the many, many people who are listening. So thank you to JT, to the GG&A team that produces these webinars, and to all of you for making time to be with us here today. I invite you to submit your questions again via the Q&A button or our website. And I would also invite you to connect on LinkedIn to me, to JT, or the firm. And if you want to talk to us about any of the issues that we identified today, please reach out. JT, thank you so much. And we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.